Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of AskGN. This time I'm joined by popular demand by our senior AMD correspondent, Snowflake, and also sometimes CEO of Gamers Nexus. We have a lot of good questions for this one. As noted recently, we're shooting 2 episodes per week now, plus the bonus Patreon episode. You go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to join us for that. And otherwise, we'll be uploading both the main ones to the main channel. She's left me already. Before that, this video is brought to you by the EVGA X299 Dark motherboard, the one that we recently used to take a top 5 world record for Firestrike overclocking results. The EVGA X299 Dark board is one of the best we've used presently in this current generation, and it has a coupon code of Gamers Nexus for a savings of $75 off for US customers. It expires on May 31st. If you've been interested in the X299 Dark with its actual VRM heatsink and actual VRM cooling capabilities, now is a good time to grab it. Use code GamersNexus at checkout. Click the link in the description below. So the first question for this week, for this episode of this week, out of the 3 we're shooting today, is from LooneyJuice, who says, besides Nvidia's quarterly report, how is the DIY enthusiast market doing, all things considered? We got past the doom and gloom articles and then into what I guess was a bit of an enthusiast boom. We're still seeing new SKUs of various types of products, but with so much hammering the market, is there even a way to get a bead on how PC components and systems have been affected? You talk about multiple SKUs entering the market. Isn't there like a new 1050 3GB model? Like, what is going on? I understand that Pascal's still doing well and understand that there's not a new generation, so clearly there's some demand, I guess. But really, a 1050 3GB? Do we really need that? We've got how many 1060s and how 2 1030s? Like, what is this product segmentation? Super, I don't know. I find it super annoying that those types of SKUs are entering the market. But I had to bring the analyst back for this question. So overall, things are, for the enthusiast market, things are doing pretty well. It's actually one of the only growing segments of the PC industry right now. Pre-built, not doing so well. So pre-builts are actually, I'm not going to be able to answer this from an AMD perspective now. I don't know why this is so difficult for her. So she's going to fire me later. The pre-builts are definitely the most suffering part of the market. There's been shrinkage year over year in anything from like Dell, HP, those types of people. And that's because think of like your average non-gaming, non-enthusiast, non-workstation consumer. What do they need a desktop for? They're probably buying a laptop or something like that, or even a glorified phone in some cases. I guess that'd be a phone glorified as a computer in some cases. So yeah, I mean, if you look at numbers from most of the analysts, including John Petty Research, although I know they're not the most highly regarded, but overall the PC segment is not doing great, but the enthusiast segment's doing really well, and enthusiast hardware is driving sales. That's why it's kind of disheartening to see the memory price issues and the GPU price issues, because it drives down adoption of enthusiast PCs and makes everything look bad, which is why companies like Nvidia and AMD are still so invested in PC gaming, because they know that's what's driving growth in any kind of desktop sector. So definitely overall the enthusiast side's doing just fine. Like I answered a few AskGNs ago, I'm a little concerned. Actually, no, it was at the PAX panel. I was on a panel at PAX East with BitWit Kyle. So in that panel, I answered a question about are we in dark times of PC space? And I think, yeah, I mean, from a memory price perspective, from GPU prices, it's definitely a bit of a problem right now for adoption, because I don't know, if memory costs half the price of your computer to build, then why are you going to build one? So that's certainly concerning, but I think we'll recover there with time. The enthusiast segment's doing pretty well overall, though. It's just that one aspect is a bit troubling. I do think we'll get through it just fine, though. Oh, and also a quick side note, again, you're right about the SKUs hammering the market. It's a bit ridiculous in some aspects, and clearly taking advantage of the current situation, which I don't blame any company for. I mean, that's kind of what they do, but you know, there's kind of a limit to what's reasonable. Next one, Tenferenzu says, wouldn't it be smart to use high-performance top-down cooler as Noctua&BeQuiet? That would also increase the airflow on the board and would result in longer component life, if I'm not mistaken. It would also cool down the VRMs and help with OC on cheaper boards. Really depends. So in an ITX box or something, yeah, downdraft is good because it will get air over the VRMs. And even if that air is warm, it's still cooler than the VRMs. It's still airflow. It still moves air across the surface and helps dissipate. Air is awful at in terms of thermal conductivity. Terrible interface to use, but obviously far better than standing air, which is what you get with a CLC that's, for example, mounted in the front. So this is actually some data we never published because we only got the testing kind of half done. It was right before Christmas, I think, so it gave people time off and stuff like that. So never quite finished it, but one thing we learned is that VRM thermals, if you measure them properly, with, say, a tower cooler, even like this piece of garbage to my left, except without the liquid cooler attached to it, tower cooler like that, even that will get some airflow over the VRMs, even if the fan's not directly pointed at them. It's just because there's air moving by nature of getting sucked into the fan. And that performs well enough that compared to like a front-mounted closed-loop liquid cooler where you've got it mounted like this is the front of the case, this is the CPU. This is the worst possible configuration you could have if there's no rear exhaust fan in the case, because in that situation, you have all this intake in the very front. The CPU is great. It's going to be really cool, probably the coolest it possibly can be within reason. And the VRMs, however, unless there's a fan above or behind them, will get pretty hot. And that's partly because you're pushing warm air into the case from the CPU, so case ambient's higher from the perspective of the VRMs. There's no airflow over those VRM components. And also, the CPU is cooler, so you can push your overclock potentially higher, which means that you're now pushing the VRMs harder, because if your CPU is cooler, you don't really necessarily know that the VRM is getting hot. And obviously, we can all assume that, but unless you have measurements somewhere, there's no good way to know what temperature they actually are, short of putting a thermocouple on it or using a board that has a sensor. And to be honest, a lot of people don't even know VRM temperature is a thing you need to worry about. I certainly didn't for a number of years when I was a new PC builder, so I don't blame anyone who doesn't. And the point is, if you're just looking at CPU temperature, because that's the most logical thing to be concerned with when overclocking, then yeah, having a really cool CPU means that you could end up pushing the VRMs way harder because you don't know that they're a problem. So downdraft coolers certainly eliminate a lot of the VRM cooling concerns, but you're going to be more limited on the CPU cooling side. So if it's not an ITX case, really the sort of best thing to do is make sure your CPU is cool to the extent that you need it to be, and then put a fan somewhere in the back, like either in the rear, and hopefully it pulls air across the VRMs, or in the top is normally better. Problem with top is if you do top front, it'll pull air out of the case before it hits a tower cooler on the CPU, in which case you actually end up with a warmer CPU because you're exhausting the cool air from intake before it ever gets there. So you don't position a top fan like exhaust too close to the front of the case. Top intake's probably the best you could possibly do. It's just that then you obviously have some dust concerns. So depending on how you feel about that, dust collecting on the top of the case, more likely to get inside of the case, that might be kind of a no-go for some people. So yeah, downdraft is definitely helpful in that capacity that you're talking about. It's just that it is naturally limited in how well it can cool the CPU itself, because I mean it's less surface area. There's fewer fins. They're not as tall. The fan is probably smaller, and it might be weaker as well, because a lot of those downdraft coolers are really meant for like either a box cooler or ITX cases, and in that capacity they don't do well on a full tower where you might be pushing the overclock harder. So the answer is it depends, and it depends on a lot of things. But would it be smart to use one? I mean, in some applications, yes, like in an ITX box especially, where you don't have access to a lot of air, and you especially don't have access to a lot of air near the VRM components, because you're really just trying to get some air into the box in general because it's so small. All you need is something. And then the CPU cooler, if it's downdraft, will take care of pretty much everything around it, including the backside of the GPU. You get rid of some of that radiative heat, although the CPU is going to be sucking it in, so the CPU will be warmer. But CPUs are also more tolerant of high temperatures than a GPU. But also VRMs are pretty tolerant of high temperatures as well, more so. So you had one last question here that you had was about the life of the components. You are not mistaken. You said would result in longer life if I'm not mistaken. But we're talking about Let's talk about the capacitors. Those are typically rated for, say, 5,000 hours of use at 105 degrees Celsius. Some of them are as bad as 2,000 or 2.5, 2,500 hours of use at 105 C, or some are 2,500 at 80 degrees Celsius or 85. It's either 80 or 85. But that's obviously, once you get into the 80s for rating the capacitors and fewer than 5,000 hours, absolutely longer capacitor life is something you should be thinking of, and a downdraft cooler would probably aid in that. But if you're looking at something like 105C at 5,000 hours, as long as the capacitors are reasonably cooled, and it's pretty hard to get a cap to 105C, as long as unless you have, like we did it with a front-mounted CLC, no exhaust and no other intake, we were able to achieve that. But just, don't be an idiot like we were intentionally doing for purposes of test, and you'll be fine. So yeah, definitely every 10 degrees Celsius increase on a capacitor is kind of like an almost exponential in how much it decreases your life of the capacitor itself. MOSFETs can take a whole lot of heat, talking 125, 150C. Chokes, inductors, same thing, can also take 125, 150C depending on what you're using. So caps, the only thing to really be worried about. And those hopefully aren't too bad depending on which motherboard you choose, but we've been able to get them hot. Anyway, yeah, downdraft coolers are good in situations where it's a concern. But if you have airflow in general in that part of the case, you'll be fine. Next question, especially if you need a cooler CPU, which is not typically as doable with downdraft. Potanox says, ask this on Discord, slapping it in here for that dank exposure. Would increasing the die size of a CPU increase cooling capability by spreading out the heat more? For example, in JayzTwoCents' recent video, he stacks 4 480 radiators and achieved about ambient temperatures with his GPU, while the CPU non-delided was still in the 70s. I remember hearing in the past with an AskGN that GPUs run cooler due to bigger die size and so less concentration of heat or something like that. So the or something like that part is right. Yeah, in the past, we've definitely talked about how, I don't know, I think I was probably talking about a comparison between two similar GPUs where the die size was significantly different. And in that situation, yeah, a larger die might help. But here's the thing, there are a lot of variables here. And transistor density impacts this a lot. So if all things are equal, if we're talking about like basically the same component but a larger die, and density, I mean, like all the transistor count, all that stuff is equal. So basically we have the same component blown up. Then the larger one will dissipate heat better. It's got a larger surface area to spread it, and the cooler won't have to deal with as high of a concentration of heat in a small area. So it's almost like it kind of depends on the amount of power you're generating per square millimeter, almost, is a good way to think about it. Where the more power, if you have like a 250 watt component and it's a really small die versus a large die and all other factors are equal, then a larger die will deal with less limitations in how the heat's being dissipated. That said, there aren't a lot of those scenarios, realistically. In the real world, a smaller die typically has different components and fewer transistors, maybe less active areas of the die for cache, or because if you look at like a block diagram of a CPU or a GPU, you'll see the different areas on the die, or it might be CCXs, might be cores, might be cache, and depending on what components have been removed on the smaller dies to get that smaller die size, it's not really a linear comparison to just straight say bigger die cooler, but bigger die cooler in the instance where bigger die and smaller die are equal for the most part. As far as Jay's content you're talking about, so if he had, I didn't watch it, but I'm sure it's good though. I like his videos when he does stuff like that. If he had a CPU in the 70s and a GPU at ambient, you can't really compare them. They're different architectures. They're different components. They have different active die areas. They have different process, made by different companies, consume different amounts of power. So can't really linearly compare them, especially when considering one's got interfaces like TIM or solder to go through as well, in addition to an IHS. So way different thermal characteristics between the two. I wouldn't compare those numbers because they're not really comparable. But I had a note here from VSG of Thermal Bench as well. VSG's a brilliant guy with regard to anything to do with thermals and testing. And if you don't know who he is, he writes for Tech Power Up as well sometimes. So I talked to him about this question as well. And he pointed out that as we enter sub 10 nanometer EUV or extreme ultraviolet lithography for making components, for making silicon, precision of the masking used for the gates will also impact heat dissipation. But otherwise, all the other stuff I said, all the variables of what is on that die makes the biggest impact. To answer your question very simply, yes, a bigger die is cooler if the two dies are very similar. And that's been the case sometimes when we test stuff. Also, a multi-die approach is really interesting too, like what AMD's done with Ryzen and what looks like it'll happen with Navi and future MCM multi-chip module NVIDIA components. That's got its own thermal characteristics because now you have multiple devices with an interconnect, and so the heat may be kind of like hot spotted in different areas as each component processes whatever it's doing. It's very interesting though. Hopefully that helps a little bit. I don't know if I think I directly answered that kind of. Next question, Sleepy Time says, wonder how many weeks that garbage AIO will sit on the bench in pieces. This person is referring to the M22 we took apart. Clearly it's not on the table anymore. However, allow me to introduce you to this. This was a bit of a nightmare to assemble on the stream for a number of reasons, so I wanted to bring it up. We have a full content piece coming that like compresses basically 3 hours of connecting two tubes and testing some fans into something that makes more sense. So if you did catch the stream though, I found out after the stream it was still kind of leaking overnight. So tightened everything. All the fittings are all tight. The tubes are clamped on with 2 zip ties. They didn't include anything else for that. But it was still leaking, and it was not leaking out of the tubes, the fittings, the connecting, anything that is kind of external to the cooler. So we let it sit overnight. I drew kind of a water level here, came back the next day, and it had dropped like another, I don't know, ½ inch on this marker. And looking at it closely, there are actually 4 screws on top of this thing up there. So there's 4 screws here. And 2 of them were not really tight at all, and the other 2 were maybe about 1 full turn away from being what I would consider acceptable tightness or torque. So if you caught the stream, this is just a teaser to what we're doing, putting together after it's all tested and everything. But basically, a lot of the leakage problems, aside from the fittings kind of being a pain in the ass and some of my own mistakes I made, I certainly was not flawless in that stream, but it was fun. I liked it. It was a lot of fun, actually. But some of the problems outside of external to user error were these 4 screws not being tight enough, and it sort of leaches out of the cap on the top and proceeds to drip down the fins, which is a real nightmare to clean up. I basically just blasted it with an air compressor because otherwise you can't get in there. So to answer your question, that cooler you're referring to is gone. I mean, it's in the box and probably turned into like art or something. But now we have this one, and you can look forward to this. I still need to do some testing on it. I realized a lot of things are like after this. I mean, being on stream is kind of a lot of pressure because there's a lot of stuff that's going on. We had an issue where the stream went out. We didn't know why. I had to restart OBS, and that fixed it. But anyway, a lot of pressure, so I forget stuff, which is why we don't stream too often, because it is actually a lot harder to complete the same objective. But it's way more fun. I love interacting with viewers. We're planning to do more streams in the future, so be sure to catch them. But it's mostly just like 3 hours of me interacting with chat for the most part, so not too exciting to watch after the fact. That said, my point is it's a much different environment than a pre-filmed thing, so I forget stuff, and I forgot I really wanted to connect a quick disconnect, which I'm going to do after this video actually. So that would have solved a lot of my problems with like stupid stuff like the order I did the cap and the pump cap, but reservoir cap. So yeah, we're going to stick these in there and then expand into radiators for some additional testing because people really wanted to see that. Anyway, that's the cooler on the bench now, and that's some behind the scenes as to what we found after the stream was over. I had time to look at it more closely, let it run overnight. Some leakage from manufacturing stuff, some leakage from fittings kind of sucking, the ones that they shipped with it, some leakage from me screwing stuff up. So it was fun though. We'll do more of these in the future, I promise. Next one, Final Spartan says, do you think CPUs will ever go back to direct die cooling? I feel like significant performance could be gained if direct die were less risky. Probably. There's two things to consider here. Direct die is more dangerous in that the now you have Intel and AMD have to warranty their component, probably. If the user installs a CPU cooler that is maybe out of spec, like a partner like one of the major cooler manufacturers didn't do the torque calculation correctly or something, or the user, say, tightens one side down harder than the other and it cracks the die. That's why it stopped, because with direct die, you do have risk of cracking the die. Even when there's like a retention kit and everything in there, you can still do it. So I don't think we're going back to direct die from the manufacturers. Now also consider, outside of potential concern where you have a lot more RMA components because people are cracking the die on the silicon or scratching off a small SMD or something like that. Outside of those things, keep in mind that the better they make their products out of the box, the less they can segment their products, and the less they can sell you on the next 5% increase in performance. So certainly there's some kind of, maybe planned obsolescence there, but in this particular instance, I can forgive it for both companies because, I mean, I wouldn't trust 90% of users with a pre-delided CPU anyway. So, and the other 10% being all the people watching this channel, because if you think about people who are maybe just getting into it, kind of scary to just give them a bare CPU and then they buy whatever cooler maybe is not perfectly compatible. You crack the die and have very expensive parts RMA. Shuvo says, why is DirectX 12 underutilized? It's been so long since this new API is launched, but games aren't using and ones which are not using it, not taking any advantage of it. Why is that? I answered this not too long ago in an AskGN. I don't remember which one it is, I'm sorry. But we had a really good response from a developer who writes for Vulkan and DirectX 12 engines. And he basically was talking about how difficult it is. Just, I don't know, maybe search DirectX 12 on the channel and look for an AskGN recently in the last couple of months. But the short of it is DirectX 12 and Vulkan are actually really hard to write for because it's with DirectX 11, you basically, and OpenGL, basically all of the optimization, all the shader optimization, the way that the code is processed, the way the different cores are or the different functions of the components, GPUs are utilized, that's basically handed off to AMD and Nvidia, and they build it in their driver team. Their driver team's experts on this topic. This is all they do is optimize and engineer for game software so that it runs well on their particular video card. And they're really good at it. And suddenly with DirectX 12 and Vulkan, you're taking all of that responsibility and you're dumping it on the head of a game developer that's probably really limited on time already. They have to focus on getting their game out the door. Optimization's not really a big concern. And so a lot of the time what you'll see, and also it takes years to get that kind of experience. Also what you see is an issue where DirectX 12 is sometimes just stuck, well, not as much lately, but used to be just stuck on a game for purposes of marketing to say it has DX12, normally a Microsoft thing to push Windows 10. And the thing with that is a lot of those games were just wrapped. So it was a DirectX 12 wrapper. It was still DirectX 11, but it was basically, imagine it having just like, you have like the game and DirectX 11, and then you have a circle around that says DirectX 12. And all it is, it handles the call, but it's not actually DirectX 12. It's not leveraging any of the resources or advantages of it. So you end up in a scenario where actually a wrapper for DX12 has some overhead. It's slightly worse than DX11. That's why in a lot of the original comparisons, I think Battlefield was one of them, and Total War even, a lot of the original comparisons, DX11 and 12, you had an issue where DX12 was worse. And if not in average frame rate, almost always in frame times, where you'd go from, say, I don't know, average frame time, or average frame time of like 16 milliseconds to occasional spikes to like 300 milliseconds, which is awful. That's a third of a second you're staring at the same frame. So, yeah, that was part of the problem, was I think turned a lot of people off because stuff was just wrapped and it said DX12, but it wasn't. The other one is it's super hard to do, DX12 and Vulkan, from a game programming standpoint. And it's just, I mean, it's not the kind of code they normally have to worry about. That's the driver developer's job, but suddenly it's not. So what I think is going to happen is these APIs need to be integrated at an engine level, and it's starting to happen with Unreal. And at an engine level, the engine programmers can do a lot of that challenge tackling of optimizing their engine in general for the API. And those engine developers have resources with NVIDIA and AMD to further optimize for the graphics cards and get help from people who've been doing it for potentially over a decade at each of those companies. So I think that's kind of what has to happen, is it needs to come down from an engine level, because it's too hard to ask a game developer to do all of this new hardware level optimization via software when they're also trying to make a game. It's a big cost overhead, especially when they probably already know how to use DirectX 11 and it might be fine for what they're doing. But yeah, I have a way better answer, though. That one's pretty good, but I have a way better answer in a previous AskGN where I read a developer's response about it. I think we have like one more, is it? Yes. Xenonuke says, nothing like making some sandwiches and sitting down only to see a new Gamers Nexus video. I included this in here because this made me smile as comp, because I'm not a big consumer of content these days. I watch it, but it's normally from like a competitive standpoint, or like we'll watch videos from, I mean, obviously I watch stuff just because it's fun too, but we'll watch videos from other channels just to see what is this card channel doing, what is this fashion channel doing, whatever, what can we learn from these people outside of our industry and adopt into our industry. So it makes it harder to watch stuff just for fun like I used to do. But I remember watching like competitive StarCraft replays with like Husky StarCraft, or watching GSL, GSTL, stuff like that at 6 in the morning before going to bed. And it was my favorite thing to get some food and then come back, sit down and watch YouTubers, or I guess it was just YouTubers really, talk about professional StarCraft. And that was a lot of fun for me. So seeing that comment made my day. But anyway, thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/GamersNexus. Help us out directly. Go to store.gamersnexus.net. If you want to pick up one of our mod mats, which are basically here at this point, they are in the airport a couple miles away, or one of our 3D laser engraved teardown crystals, which the large one is basically big enough for hand-to-hand combat. And also we have an autographed version now if you want that. So thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.